All right. Hello and welcome everyone to another of the 2022 builds refreshes. Today we're going to be talking about LAVOS, or more accurately, we're going to be talking about why LAVOS kind of just doesn't function in terms of what he is clearly supposed to do. For that, let's talk about what LAVOS is up to and what's special about LAVOS, and that is that his abilities work off cooldowns instead of you having to spend any energy on them. This is obviously considerably different, as the vast majority of Warframes have nothing to do with cooldowns, and instead, you can just spam their abilities as much as you want if you have the energy to make those abilities function. So with that, instead, LAVOS can just hit his 1, and then you have an 8-second cooldown, hit his 2, and then you have a 5-second cooldown, and then throw his 4 out there, and you have, after its effect is done being cast, you have a 30-second cooldown. So, you have all these abilities, and usually you'd have his 3, but I have that subsumed right now. But even if you subsume an ability, after it is done, it also has a short cooldown. So with all that, you also have a system on LAVOS where you can hold the abilities, and you can invert this if you want. You can hold the abilities, and you can mix an element into his abilities so that the next time you cast it, that ability will also do that damage type and proc that damage type. And all of that is adorable, but not effective as compared to just shooting guys. So, the number one way to take advantage of LAVOS in general is to use him as a railjack pilot, because you can use all the railjack abilities with relatively short cooldowns on all of those abilities that you'd want to be using, and it's actually really good for doing fast runs of railjack if you have sort of unprepared builds for that, where you're maybe not running Protea or Dispenser subsumed on your preferred Warframe. LAVOS is actually really good for piloting the railjack, and honestly, not much else. So, the build for him, and he's ranked 25, but I'm above MR 30, so he's maxed on everything essentially, is just this. I've put 3 Forma into him, and at some point, I had tested enough things where I realized it's not worth building around his abilities. So instead, this build is quite simply a roar build. I can get a 60% increase in damage for 46 seconds, and it costs me nothing. In addition to that, I have some duration on here because that helps roar, get that extra duration, and also it is going to make my statuses last longer, which is going to make things like heat and slash, if it's ever necessary, do more damage from my weapons. And then I just have corrosive projection equipped to knock down that armor on the enemies a bit. You could instead go with growing power, but I really don't want to waste an aura forma on LAVOS. Now let's talk about the things you could build for and what they ended up making me realize. And that's that if we look at his augments, we have Swift Bite, which is the number one thing that people go to when it's like, oh, if you just want to make it so that he has less cooldowns, you would simply use Swift Bite, right? Because this is a augment for his 1, where it reduces ability cooldowns by 4 seconds when at least 4 enemies are hit, and it also increases the range of his 1 to make it easier to hit those 4 enemies. And that sounds all fine and good. And also, as your efficiency is higher, this will actually give you more back. But that would mean you'd have to build around efficiency on LAVOS. And that's already not good, because Transmutation Probe, which would normally be his 3, also is affected by efficiency. But at the point where you are wasting mod slots on efficiency, you're going to make his abilities so bad that they're not worth hitting. So you've put a build in that requires you to constantly spam your abilities, which, by the way, is hugely inconvenient because you need to like make them elemental and do all this stuff before you throw them out. And it's extremely, extremely slow and devoid of opportunity in its cost. And doing all that and building around LAVOS' Swift Bite and all this some such only made me realize that there is no reason to cast LAVOS' abilities. You can justify throwing his 4 out sometimes, just to like maybe, you know, get some good, decent, okay damage on some fodder enemies. And like you can cast his Vile Rush as like a dash, and that's fine. And whatever you subsume on him, well, not whatever you subsume on him, some things that you subsume on him do work. Things like Gloom are completely non-functional on him. And things like what we did with Inaros, where we built around Ureli's playstyle, that instead has a cooldown between each thing you can throw, and thus is completely useless, as opposed to just firing a gun. And all those things really come together to make it so that LAVOS just isn't very good. He's a weapons platform that is good for Railjack, and that's pretty much what's going on. And to showcase the kind of just lack of effective damage, I've thrown this together. So this is increased range, increased duration, lower efficiency, because that's not going to matter here, and 300% strength. This build is not, you're not going to want to use this because their survivability on LAVOS is not particularly good. But we are going to just toss this in here and just show off what the damage is of his 4 on some just random schmucko enemies. And that is considering that we're going to have to kill the Ancients first. Now, the thing that everyone in the comments is going to point out if I don't point it out is that his 4, whenever you use it, it will get more damage the more statuses are applied to enemies, like Condition Overload, basically. And that's all fine and good, but LAVOS himself cannot apply enough statuses alone in order to make that worthwhile, and he can't loop it fast enough to make that worthwhile. And literally 10 times out of 10, you are better off simply firing a gun that you would not use for applying statuses and that you would instead use just for killing everyone and killing everyone that way. So we're going to just like dump these level 185s in here. We are going to kill the Ancients first, because if you don't kill the Ancients, then this does like super nothing. We're going to throw heat on it, as he has, you know, that high dot damage. Throw this out here, and it's gonna kill, you know, some of them. And this is at 300% strength. As you can see, at 300% strength, it comically tickles these level 185 bombards, which are not even Steel Path enemies. The Steel Path enemies are hilariously stronger, and also they'd be shooting at you if you could even make a build that would do this much damage viable there. Now, what you could do instead, you might be saying, is, oh, just shoot them and, like, you know, get, like, their statuses up first. But the problem with that is that I could just keep shooting them, and even with this unbuffed up from its arcane secondary, this would be faster than going through the process of putting statuses on them and then casting my 4 on them. Like, to apply statuses to that many enemies, you could use something like, let's say, the Phantasma. But also, the Phantasma will evaporate those enemies in Steel Path levels and for quite a long time into Steel Path levels. So you'd never have a reason to use your 4 while you were firing the Phantasma. Also, in terms of it being AoE, like, I'm holding a Glaive Prime. Why would I ever consider using LAVOS' abilities with how slow and restricted they are, as there is the very long timer, especially at this low efficiency. Oh, well, I guess that's just because we can't return it with transmutation, but like 30 seconds between this ability, it's just like not usable. And you might be thinking, well, just use his 1, but his 1 does not do good damage, and like you could use his 2. Well, it's Airburst on this build because I was trying that as a potential thing that could work. It didn't. Using his 2, like, to spread status in its buff state, it's just not very good. Using the 3 to spread status it's just not very good. Using his 3 to get efficiency back to keep casting the 4 and like apply status that way, it's all just slow and it's all just bad, and it doesn't scale well enough into higher level enemies. And that's the plain and simple thing for LAVOS, is that he's kind of a glorified Railjack pilot, and everything else that he does is related to his like pretty fine tanky stats, where you can kind of just throw the Umbral mods and adaptation on him, and he can survive pretty well as kind of an Inaros aside that's good at piloting a Railjack. But yeah, I decided on no Steel Path run for this, because whatever Steel Path run I would do is basically just a showcase of whatever weapons I decide to bring, and Roar, which you can do on literally any Warframe. So yeah, that's LAVOS. He is a frame that released in a state and then did not receive enough buffs to be relevant or have a defined playstyle that would be worth your time. And that's unfortunate, because I think he looks really cool, and I think that the base idea around his kit and even what his like abilities are and do is super interesting. It's just not very good.